Good morning. We are on Kuf Zayin with Aleph 116a, and we're 3 lines from the top of the page. We're coming towards not the Shulchan Aruch, the Gemara, but we're coming towards the end of the Gemara's description that sets us up for the recitation of the story, the recitation of Haggadah. We're putting together all the elements way from the beginning. Elements, literally elements on the table. We learned yesterday to put the matzah down. We learned that the matzah has to be broken. We discussed the whole matzahs also, giving us 3 matzahs total. We learned you have to have charoises. We learned you have to dip to raise curiosity. We learned you have to wash because you're dipping. We learned that because one of the matzahs have to be broken, staf yachatz. We learned that you have to make kiddush, obviously. We also learned that you have to remove the plate away, or remove the table away to raise curiosity. What else did I miss? That we learned was all prep to set ourselves up for the kid asking questions and us responding, which is going to come in the next mission. The last element is we learned yesterday that you have to have charosis on the plate, on the table, and that's part of being present when you recite the Haggadah. So now we're going to get to the ingredients. First, why the charosis is there. The Mishnah told us it's a dispute. The Mishnah said this. Rabbi Levi Bar Tzadok said it's a mitzvah.
We also learned about 3 matzahs.
Right, there's about 3 matzahs, and one has to be broken because of the charosis. One has to be a piece, right? Because it's poor man, but you have to have 2 whole ones for the Mishnah, right? And in the Mishnah, when the Mishnah told us that you have to have charosis, the Mishnah said, put charosis even though it's not a mitzvah. And the other opinion said, Rabbi Levi Bar Tzadok says, no, it is a mitzvah. The Gemara is first going to discuss why is it there if it's not a mitzvah according to opinion A, and then B, according to opinion B, why it's a mitzvah. Yeah, as we're going to see, both of these opinions actually remain in the halacha. We spoke about it a little bit on Pesach at one of the occasions between the Chabayim somewhere. We spoke about this a little bit. So let's have a look. Yeah, 3rd line from the top of the page, the middle of the line after the colon. First quotes the Mishnah. Mitzvah. The first opinion in the Mishnah was that charosis has to be present on the table, even though charosis is not a mitzvah. So the Gemara asks, mitzvah, if charosis is not a mitzvah, according to this opinion, mishomai ma'isila. So why is it present? Why do you have to bring it if it's not a mitzvah? So he explains. Omar Rav Ami says, mishum kappa, because of kappa. Kappa, we said, was either a worm that could be dangerous to the person eating it, and charosis offsets it, or it's some sort of toxin that charosis offsets. If I remember correctly, in the Rebbe's Haggadah, he goes with the opinion that it is a worm. I don't know why, I haven't looked into it yet, but if I remember correctly, that's never writes in the Haggadah. Okay, so according to this opinion, charosis is there for your health to offset kappa by dipping the lettuce or dipping the marar into charosis. It offsets whatever danger the kappa would bring, whether it's a toxin or a worm. So on the subject of kappa, the Gemara tells us the following, and I hope I remember all the translations. Amar Rav Asi says, kappa dechasa, the solution for kappa that's within lettuce is to eat chama. Chama, if I remember correctly, is radish. So to offset the kappa that's in lettuce, eat radish. Kappa de chama, to offset the kappa that exists in radish, karti, eat leek. Kappa de karsi, the tox or the kappa that exists within leek, the way to offset it is chamimi, hot water. Kappa de kulu, to offset the dangerous effect of kappa in any of these, chamimi is hot water. So it seems like kappa was a thing people were dealing with back in the day. They had to know which foods offset which kappa.
So very aware of sterilization. Back to hot water.
Perhaps, yeah, presumably. And it could also be that the word kappa was just used as a generic word for anything dangerous within food, whether it's asbestos, whether it's
Pesticide or.
A pesticide, a pesticide is anti, but whether it's a asbestos, it's a worm or a bug, or if it's a toxin, whatever it was, kappa was like a generic term for that. And then for that to like know which vegetables offset which kappa from which other vegetable. Okay. And now the Gemara gives a sort of spiritual incantation that can ward off the negative effect of kappa, which makes it seem like it's a spiritual thing.
Should have had this in our discussion when we discussed.
That's right. Way back when we spoke about this, we speak about it earlier in Psachim. So here's another one of those things. In the meantime, I guess before you get to eat the offset food, so after you ate lettuce, before you ate radish, or after you ate radish, before you ate leek, Nema, you should say, Nema Hachi, say the following. Kappa, kappa, you kappa, kappa. Decharina lach, I know you. Ulashib bentech, and your 7 daughters. Ulatamni kalasich, and your 8 daughter-in-laws.
They write that on an amulet.
No, just to say it. Floor is open for interpretation, but that's what the Mishnah says. That's what the Gemara says.
Never tried to interpret this.
Sorry?
I don't interpret myself.
Why not?
Can't do it.
Try, think about it. What do daughters represent? What do daughter-in-laws represent? Why 7 daughters? Why 8 daughter-in-laws? Think about it. You know, some spiritual idea of what the relationship between mother and daughter is, or father and daughter, father and daughter-in-law. Why is it so important to know you? I don't know. There's 7 middays somehow related to that.
Floor is open.
Floor is open. I don't have any ideas. Just share. Just
Hashem is teaching us, perhaps, that we can get along with our in-laws, then. Okay.
then no kappa.
Okay.
You can get along with your in-laws. Straight. You remind me. I once pulled over and taken in by a cop because I didn't know I had a suspended license. I had no idea. You know, I had moved and they were mailing to my old address, and I didn't know I had a suspended license. It was in New York. Anyway, it took me to courthouse. I paid a fine and I left. It was no big deal. Anyway, it's just in upstate New York. So while I'm in the with the police in the car, so I asked the officer. I said, in our tradition, we learn that whatever happens to a person in life is a lesson. There's got to be a lesson in my life mission. So I'm here with you in the car. We're driving. We have about 20 minutes. So what do you think the lesson is for me here? So the guy says, well, the lesson is probably not to speed and not to block your black window.
Uh-huh.
I was looking for some sort of lofty idea. He's like, just keep it simple. The lesson is don't drive with your back window blocked and don't speed. Like, okay, good lesson. I'll take that. So instead of thinking so deeply, just get along with your in-laws. That's it.
Yeah.
She reminded me of that story. Okay.
We once made a party for my mother-in-law, but I couldn't. We never got along. And it was her 70th anniversary, for 70th birthday, and all her friends are sitting around the table. And I had a couple of drinks, and everybody's saying something.
Should I turn off the recording first?
Yeah.
Okay, quick. Let's finish.
And I get up there and I say, my mother-in-law, she's a deer. And everybody, oh, that's so nice. So I wish it was hunting season.
Okay, moving forward. So that was opinion number 1, that charesis is not a mitzvah. It's there to offset kappa. Okay. Now it says the second opinion in the Mishnah, which was that it is a mitzvah. Mitzvah. The said the charesis is a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to be present there. So the Gemara asks, by mitzvah, what is the nature of this mitzvah, to have charesis? So Rabbi Levi says, Zechel tapuach, it's to remember the apple tree. Why do I have to remember apple trees? So Rashi tells us, citing to a verse in Shir Hashirim. In Shir Hashirim it says, where's that verse in Shir Hashirim? Yeah. Tachas tapuach oireritzich, I think I have to pronounce it. Under the apple orchard, you were awakened, or you were inspired. And this is a reference to when the Jewish people were in slavery and the husbands didn't want to have children. The wives seduced their husbands under the apple orchard and the angels came and protected them and allowed them to have children and flourish. So to remember that, we have charoises, which would imply what's one of the ingredients in your charoises? Apples. To remember the apple orchard. That's Rabbi Levi's opinion. Rabbi Yochanan says, it's to remember the mortar, which is interesting. Rabbi Levi and Rabbi Yochanan want to say to remember the apple orchard, and want to remember the mortar. They're actually, in some ways, actually two opposites. Because the apple orchard is to describe God's miracle, and protection, even in slavery, whereas the mortar is to remember the difficulty of slavery, which is the opposite.
And
right?
no protection.
And no protection.
The children were actually
That's right. So
buried in the mortar.
that's right. So there's a duality here, in that we remember the difficulty, and simultaneously in that same element, the charesis, also to remember God's protection even while things are difficult. This is an interesting little combination there. Yeah.
It's two opposites almost.
Yeah. But the apple orchard is not God taking us free. This is while we're still in slavery. It's God's protection while we're in slavery. So in other words, charesis is to remember the slavery. But in slavery, there's the slavery of it, the mortar, and then there's God's protection of it, the apple orchard.
Mhm.
And even, so there's a kind of duality that even before redemption comes, God's there while we're still suffering, making mortar. An interesting kind of duality that exists here within the charesis. So Amar Abaye says,
Kind of like both.
yeah,
The porosis has the consistency of mortar.
that also has apples.
And it also has the ingredient of apple,
Yeah.
which
Yep. Yep. Never speaks about that the apple, also fruits and apple are not necessary food items, they're luxury items. Right? They're symbolically, fruits are metaphorical to that which isn't necessary, but that which makes life more beautiful. Right? Whereas mortar at the same time is the exact opposite. It's the most difficult of all work, says the Medrash. Right? So they're explained in a famous sickle that talks about the message of charesis, how mortar, which is the most difficult of work, represents the core worst of evil, and fruit, which is the luxury of beauty and good taste, is the height of spirituality. And in one thing, you have both, as if to say the ultimate is the transformation of the most difficult to the most sublime. So the same thing is reflected here. It's mortar, but in mortar, there's the greatest blessing. They're having children miraculously under the apple tree. It's kind of duality here. Okay, Amar Abaye, therefore Abaye says, therefore, tzarech lak huye, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. You have to make the charesis, lakyoye is like a tart or like sour, right? The tzarech l'sam chuye, and it should be thick. Lakhuye, it should be tart or sour. Zeichel tapuach, remember the apple. It should be tart. It should be what's another word? Snidel translates as tart, but there's another translation I'm looking for. Not sour. Tart, I guess is the right word.
tangy.
Acidic.
Yeah, acidic. That's the word I'm looking for. Thank you. Acidic. Because of the apple. And it should be thick. To remember the mortar. There's other elements which are not mentioned here, but they're mentioned in the Talmud Yerushalmi. For example, there in the Yerushalmi it says it should be runny. The charesh should be runny, which is the opposite of this, which says thick. Yeah, because the runny is to remember the blood. It's thin to remember the blood. Sorry. Yeah. So we do both. We start off it's thick, and then we add wine later and make it thin. Yeah.
For that reason?
Yeah, to combine both. Yeah. We'll get to that in the halacha and in the Rebbe Zagada.
It also has to do with the matzah not getting wet too much. Or is that
Well, we ended making it wine. We ended up putting the wine in before we did. That's why we shake it off.
Mhm.
We also shake it off because they don't want to ruin the flavor of
I'm
mara.
not worried about the matzah getting wet.
Well, we are, which is why we shake it off. But the real reason to shake it off is because they don't want to. We spoke about this a little bit on Pesach. We'll get to it when we get to Shulchan Aruch. We shake it off because they don't want to ruin the flavor of mara. If you put too much, it'll ruin the flavor of mara. But simultaneously, if there's an issue of kappa, you have to dip the entire thing into the charis. Otherwise, it's dangerous, right? But if it's because of no more kappa, and today we're only doing it for mitzvah, we therefore put a little bit and shake it off just to get the mitzvah, because you don't want to ruin the flavor of mara.
Yeah, and if it's thick though, you couldn't really shake it off, right?
Well, I mean,
I mean,
you could shake
well,
things off.
You could.
Yeah. Anyway, okay, let's
We're
conclude.
doing both.
Yeah. I want to conclude the Gemara here, and then I want to make an important comment on the question of charosis, which should be a glaring question. So let's see. Tanya Kavasei Rabbi Yochanan. We have a Mishnah text that backs up Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan being a scholar of the early generations of the Gemara. So the Gemara quotes to a Mishnah text that supports him, which says as follows: "Quote, Tavlin, you should have spices in your charosis. Zeichel teven, to remember the teven is the straw. So how does teven get to spices? Well, one way to think about it is because you have to grind up the straw to mix into the mortar. Another way to think about it is just like straw is like an adhesive that keeps the mortar together, make it more dense. Spice also kind of brings the charosis together. Anyway, the point is you have to put spices in there to remember the straw. And charosis, the charosis itself, it's to remember the mortar. So here we have a Mishnah text that backs up Richan's position that charosis is to remember the mortar. Conclusion. Rabbi Levi said, he's the one that posited that charosis is a mitzvah to begin with, either to remember the mortar or to remember the apple orchard, and also having spices in there to remember the straw. So he says, the sellers of charosis, or the sellers of spices in Jerusalem used to say, come buy your spices for your charosis mitzvah. That's how they would like announce themselves in the market. It's at a Pesach, come buy your spices for your mitzvah, indicating that everybody knew it was for a mitzvah. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, go
It
ahead.
could also be spices when you look at the process, you may see the specks of tavlin.
In the same way you would see specks of straw. Yeah. Yeah, that's like the adhesive kind of thing. Yeah. Okay, so this is the end of the Gemara that discusses, first of all, charosis, and it discusses all the prep before the recitation of Haggadah. The next mission is going to be the second cup is filled, the 4 questions are asked, and the answer, that's going to be the following rest of the Mishnah, rest of the Gemara. Now, I want to comment something. On Monday, we'll get to the Shulchan Aruch that discusses all of this. But just it's something interesting, which is the Gemara didn't tell us what charosis is. It told us put spices, make it thick for mortar, and make it thin, make it acidic for apples. But what is it? Where are the ingredients? So it's strange, right? It doesn't say charosis is a mixture of doesn't say any of that, right? It's almost as if the reader already knows what charosis is. And it's telling you, when you make your charosis, you know what that is, right? So when you make it, make sure it has spices, make sure it's got apples, and make sure it's thick.
So predate, it goes back.
Right. So that go back earlier, which is something that people knew already. And they're being told, make it this way for this, make it that way for this. Right, which explains why there are so many different varying customs for charosis. Because there's no the Gemara doesn't give a recipe. It tells you elements. Make sure it's thick. Make sure it's got spices. But doesn't. The Yerushalmi has other such suggestions, like make sure it's thin. And other things like that.
Was it an Egyptian thing?
Oh, so 1 second. So before I get to that, so this explains why there's so many different customs for charosis, depending on which region you were in and what stuff were available to you. Right, different regions, different spices, and different foods were available. Right. And you just use those ingredients and try to match the Gemara's description of what you have to do. Yeah, there's that element. There's also the element of, in different regions, they would cite to different midrashim to try to add other elements of remembrance. For example, there's some people have a custom to try to get as many of the 7 kinds of which Israel is blessed into the charosis, pomegranate dates, which we don't have, obviously, none of us do that, right? But that, in Ashkenazi countries didn't have access to pomegranates and dates, but as far as the countries invite us, they would do that. So in the North African countries, or when you go, let's say to
Olives.
Yeah, to olives, you go toward the Middle East, and you go to like the Eurasia. So depending on where you were, you had different ingredients trying to match the Gemara's description, and perhaps invoke other remembrances. Right? This whole thing, the whole mitzvah here is to do things to remember. Remember the slavery, remember the difficulty, remember God's blessing, right? So make food that has other symbolism and ingredients, kind of like Rosh Hashanah, where you have different simonim to remember different things. Now there's a I was listening to an interview with a woman who wrote a small booklet on charoises, which I actually want to order. I want to get the book. I found her interview very interesting. She makes this whole case that charoises, and she cites the sources in old Greek texts. The charoises was a Greek dip, a delicacy that people knew about. It was Greek and then became Roman charoises. And there was
it would predate.
it's
not even in the mitzvah.
it's not predated. It's simultaneous to the Gemara.
Moshe, not Simon.
Well, okay, so
otherwise it would be.
no, well, it's definitely a rabbinic mitzvah. It's a rabbinic mitzvah to have charoises, but everybody knew what charoises was, and different people had different ways of making it, either thicker or thinner. Let's just imagine, like, I don't know, an olive dip.
Mhm.
So some people put dill in it, some people don't put dill in it. Some people make it a little more mayonnaise, some people put less mayonnaise, right? But the general idea of olive dip, some people use green olives, some use black olives, some use both, right? So we have all kinds of foods that we give like a general label to, and then depending on where you are, you make them a little differently. So she posits that charoises is the same way. Charoises was a Greek/Roman dip that people knew of, and the sages are telling you it's a mitzvah to have that at your seder to remember these things, and then told you whenever you make your own ingredients because you always make your charoises. But when you do it, make sure it's thick, make sure it's this, make sure it's that. Make sure it's tart, because if you make a non-tart charoises, make sure your charoises is tart, right? Implying that you already know what it is. So implying it's already a well-known dip that exists. It's just a question of how to make it and what ingredients to put into it. And that's why there's no list of ingredients anywhere. Which is probably,
That may have
seems rational, it seems reasonable to me.
That may have been the first time it has actually been discussed or laid out in specifics, but it may have been already known prior to the Greek.
To the Jewish people.
Yeah.
It's definitely a rabbinic mitzvah. It's definitely a rabbinic mitzvah. It's not a biblical mitzvah. It's a rabbinic mitzvah, which means it would have come around somewhere during the Second Temple period. Maybe earlier, I don't know.
That's known.
If it's definitely a rabbinic mitzvah. There's no biblical thing. It's a rabbinic mitzvah, certainly. If it predates which means it comes from the Second Temple period. If it predates the Second Temple period, it would be from the prophets, not from the sages. And then we would know this is a mitzvah from the Nevi'im. Like, for example, on Shana Rabbah, we bang the 5 things. That's a mitzvah from the Nevi'im, a minhag from the Nevi'im. So we know that. It's a minhag custom that comes back from the prophets. The charoises is not one of those things that go back to the prophets, which means it comes from the Second Temple period.
Okay.
Right? Which means charoises is a known, this is her pot, this is what she posits in it. And it sounds reasonable to me. I have no reason to assume not. It doesn't, to me, it doesn't offend my religious sensibilities to.
I know.
Like, there's a known dip called charoises. People have it. Good. So put it on your table, make it in a certain way so you get all those remembrances. Right? Right? That's what the Gemara is telling you. Presumably they're having charoises because they're worried about kappa anyway. Right? They're worried about kappa. Right? So even if you believe that charoises is a mitzvah, it's not because you don't believe kappa exists. Kappa exists. It's a thing you got to deal with, right? You have to have kappa for to offset the danger anyway. You have to have charoises to deal with kappa anyway. But the mitzvah is make sure your charoises is made in X fashion so X has remembrances. Right? Implying that charoises already existed as a thing. Presumably, I think she's right. Anyway, I want to get her. I only listened to an interview. I'll get her book, and by next year I'll have a better idea. Maybe next year instead of the Kairach files, we'll do the charoises files. Okay, a wonderful day, a good Erev Shabbos. Monday we'll get to the halakha of all of this, and then we'll continue on our seder.
Wow.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day and a good Erev Shabbos.
That was very good.